and welcome back again. We continue with our program, and we start with the first panel discussion today, actually. Here with me in the studio in Belgrade, Mr. Vladimir Pavlović, Senior Policy Advisor at the belgrade.open.school. He will be moderating the next session. Vlado, the floor is yours.
Thank you, and I think it was really inspiring piece of two documentaries that we saw actually in the previous session, and I really do deeply regret that we don't have all those wonderful people here with us today. Why? Because I think in the core of this conference is actually what they are doing and what they are achieving. So you or all of you who are today with us, you get a chance to see about the real community workers, people actually who are change makers, those who make the difference. And I think one of the overarching topics in our conference is actually how to become a changer and how to achieve this kind of a sense of feeling for community development, and how to achieve this in a very challenging environment of post-COVID, of the new normality, of this new era that we are facing in. And for my behalf, I'm really it's an honor for me to welcome all of you to this panel session. And as Anna told, so this is going to be the session with the title Integration for Development. Where do we go from here? It's the first discussion that we're going to have in our annual conference. And I'm really privileged to moderate this and to greet our two keynote speakers. His Excellency, Mr. Tobias Flessenkemper, who is head of the Council of Europe mission here to Serbia, and Mr. André Munter, who is a desk officer at Enlargement, Western Europe and Northern Cooperation Unit at the European Parliament. So thank you for being here with us. Thank to all of you who are here following this panel. So as you might have seen from the program, and as you see now, so Ms. Tanja Miščević, Deputy Secretary General of the Regional Cooperation Council and the former chief negotiator, was supposed to be here today with us, but unfortunately during the weekend she had some unexpected health problems and she was not able to join us. So in behalf of the team that's organizing this, I just would like to wish Tanja fast and full recovery, and I do hope that she will be, and I'm sure that she will be with us for the very first time when we are going to discuss and have a conference or a similar gathering when we will be able to speak about the topics related to the EU perspectives of the region. Before starting the technical remarks, so you can participate in this discussion by posing questions. You can do it either using the option in the Zoom, or you can also pose a question or a comment via Facebook, because this session and the entire conference is being also broadcasted via official Facebook page of the Belgrade Open School. So before we start, and before I pass the floor to my honorable keynote speakers, I would just like to share with you, as a kind of introduction, a little bit of thoughts and what was behind the scenario that came out with this conference. So somewhere late 2019, when we started to discuss about the potential topics for this 6th annual Move.Link.Engage conference, it was really obvious that 2020 is going to be the exciting year. So for many reasons. Why? Because we had several parallel, very important processes going on. So we had, for the beginning, we had Brexit at its peak. So we had a third extension of the Brexit deadline. We had the upcoming elections in Great Britain, and the EU and Great Britain were in this kind of a vicious circle trying to get out of this Brexit scenario without not making a negative impact of the fundamentals of the EU integration, of the EU project, but also not affecting the fundamentals of the democracy system in Great Britain. So this was really an exciting period, but this was the period where I would say uncertainty was a kind of a buzzword. Why? Because nobody knew how this is going to end and what kind of impact it's going to have on the European integration and European project as a whole. The second very important part and a very important process was actually, of course, the new enlargement approach. So back at the late 2019, it was very obvious from the initiative made by France at that time that something's going to change in the landscape of the enlargement policy, and that we are going to have a wholly new approach to the negotiation and to new potential membership to the European Union. So what turned out back in the early 2020 to be really a new enlargement approach, what brought new credible, predictable, dynamic, and more politically steered process was in 2019 something at the very beginning. So for us as a team, it was very interesting to see how this is going to develop, and this was also one of the potential topics of our conference. So what happened, this new enlargement methodology, of course, because it became the part of the enlargement package for Albania, North Macedonia, Montenegro accepted. We are having a rather ambiguous situation whether Serbia is really accepting this methodology as its own methodology, but it really developed to the very interesting course of action. And finally, at that period, what was very interesting for us was the fact that 2020 was the year of the elections all around the Western Balkans. And we were at that time waiting for the 4 rounds of election to happen in the 4 Western Balkans countries, plus election in Croatia. So always elections are a period of new hope and new expectations. And for the countries in the region which struggle both internally with challenges related to develop the rule of law and the human rights and overall democratization process, as well regionally in establishing regional cooperation, this was really an important period. So all of these processes actually were very important, and they, at that moment, were on the table as some of the topics that we could cover in our Move.Link.Engage conference. But as you all know, the uncertainty, which was actually a kind of a red line in all of this process, got a totally new meaning with the COVID-19 pandemic. What we had, and actually what happened, you had a situation where a crisis that doesn't know borders hit an entity without the borders, resulting with walls raising out all across Europe. So the EU, in its very beginning, although its answer was not exemplary, as stated, gave a very quick response, and that response came out with a new budget and a new generation for EU recovery instrument. So EU came out with 2 major policies trying to answer on the post-COVID or ongoing COVID world. So we'll see in the times ahead of us what kind of impact this will really have on addressing all the issues raised by COVID, but it is important that something is actually happening. So EU is being giving the answer to this. What actually is here very important, that the new normality caused by the COVID is here. For the Western Balkans is here to stay, and Western Balkans now is in the middle of the processes, one being launched by the EU, but the other processes which are happening here, we should give the answer to the COVID era. We should secure a kind of a sustainable development of the individual countries and the entire region, but which also should steer the improvement of democratization and overall reform processes which are ongoing in all of the countries of the Western Balkans region. So this new normality and post-COVID area actually brought us with a very simple notion of what should be dealing in this conference. So we'll start today with the fundamentals of answering the challenges of COVID-19 crisis, And then as the conference rolls on, we'll go into the more detailed, more policy-oriented sectors. So we'll discuss the policy topics, but at the same time, we are going to discuss the principles. And some of the principles that actually are the key ones for having any kind of a meaningful answer or making any kind of a progress when it comes to the overall democratization of the region are partnership, solidarity, and responsibility. So let me start by asking His Excellence, Mr. Flessenkemper. So what is your opinion? To what extent will this region be able to answer to the COVID-19 crisis and to this COVID or post-COVID area when it comes to trying to finalize some reform process, achieving, striving towards the rule of law and the human rights? So how to move on with the democratization of the region, having in mind this new normality? So, Your Excellency, the floor is yours.
Ovu novu eru.
Yes, thank you very much.
Hvala puno.
We'll try to find out how to work through the browser with Zoom.
Hoću da vidim kako da radim sa ovim Zoomom.
And now I hear both languages.
Čujem sada oba jezika.
So I hear myself now interpreted.
Čujem i sebe i čujem i prevodioca.
Let me just find out how to do this with your colleague, because I'm just checking.
Samo da pokušam da proverim s vašim kolegom kako ovo da uradim.
Because I don't know, because the browser function doesn't allow me to
ne dozvoljava mi ova funkcija da...
But I can start, but it's really complicated.
Mogu da počnem, ali jako je čudno pošto čujem i sebe i čujem i prevod istovremeno na istom kanalu.
So maybe you start with, I'm really sorry, you start with André, because...
Jako mi je žao, ali možda bolje da počnete sa Andrejem, pošto ne mogu drugačije.
Problem. So thank you very much for this. We'll get back on to your comments. Actually, for us, it is very important to have a perspective from the Council of Europe, since the overall issue of democratization and the reform process in the region are actually the issues which actually focus on the states themselves, but they need here the help of all the international partners which are present, and one of the very important international partners is Council of Europe. Now, André, so let me then get back to you. When we were discussing about preparation for this panel, we were talking about some key important events that pave the environment in which we can now talk about the partnership, the responsibility, and the solidarity. So we had this new enlargement methodology. We also had elections in Serbia. So we are awaiting now the country reports, which should be on the table in some fortnight. And actually really an exciting time to discuss about the enlargement perspective of the region. And atop all of this, we have also the COVID, which is actually, as I said, a kind of a new framework that we should live by and take into account. So some of your thoughts on this, André.
Can you hear me? Okay, I can see you. Thank you. Good afternoon. Thank you to Belgrade Open School for having me, and thank you, Vladimir, for this introduction. Let me first of all specify that I will speak on my own behalf. Why? Because it is not possible to represent the European Parliament in all its variety of MEPs coming from close to 200 national political parties. So I will voice my own views, but of course also offer from time to time a European Parliament perspective. Let me maybe start out with the more general picture. I think that what we are seeing, what we are witnessing, is pretty much a continuation of what I like to call fragile stabilization or stabilized fragility in the region. Why? Because we have seen some democratic backsliding in when the pandemic broke out. We could go in more detail later on. It was in some cases very obvious. We had the respirator procurement scandal in Bosnia-Herzegovina. We had problems of intimidation, harassment of media in Serbia, just to name one thing. Very controversial way of declaring the state of emergency, largely bypassing the assembly, which of course is to us in the European Parliament a very sensitive point. And this is where I would like to stress also that, I mean, one of our main concerns is the lack of parliamentary oversight on what is going on, and the overall, especially in the first stages of the pandemic, the overall or widespread inactivity of parliaments in the region, and that's why we are insisting on more parliamentary oversight. We had the first Western Balkans Speaker Summit in late January, just actually before the pandemic broke out. With a joint statement by all the participants, the speakers from the parliaments of the Western Balkans 6, that we really need a parliamentary dimension to the enlargement process as a whole. So I think there is widespread consensus that COVID, not only in the region, also in some EU member states, led to restrictive measures that should end as soon as possible, and that require oversight, which is currently lacking. Let me maybe in this context also mention, it could be of interest to the audience, that Ursula von der Leyen, in her State of the Union address last week, she promised, and I personally think this is a very welcome move, that the first ever annual report on respect or disrespect of the rule of law in the EU member states will see the light of day, let's say, or maybe also highlighting a dark side of what is going on in some EU member states by the end of this month. I think this is important, and it should be specific. It should be about naming and shaming of what goes wrong in the EU member states. And I'm not referring to any member state in particular, but it is about many more member states than just Hungary and Poland, Malta on the passport issue, Romania, Bulgaria are in their 14th year of post-accession monitoring. But it is also about my own native country, Belgium, you know, which came in an unfavorable spotlight some time ago because of the very suspicious death of the Slovak national 2 years ago, Josef Chovanec, which has been all over the media. So I hope that the Commission in that report will have the courage to be specific. Why? Because this will also help us to counter the look at yourselves rhetoric that is increasingly coming from people, leaders in the region, to us, like, you know, look at what is going on in your own member states. At least we will be able to see that we are not willingly blind to deficiencies in the rule of law area in our own member states. So I personally look forward to that particular report. Now, maybe I could, I mean, I prepared so much and there is so much to say. Maybe a few words on the methodology, that the new methodology, and look at the title or the subtitle, it's called New Methodology for Enlargement to the Western Balkans. My first criticism would be, and what about Turkey, which is still an enlargement country? But this has been going on for some time. So when it comes to the new methodology, there are maybe a couple of things that I would like to highlight. And I hope that in the forthcoming enlargement package, the Commission will also live up to the promises that it makes in this new methodology, like presenting a much clearer picture of the way the authorities in the Western Balkans live or do not live up to their promises, to give more clear guidance on what should be done in the year to come, etc. So I would personally expect in these in this enlargement package and in the country reports, I would most certainly expect more detail, because up to now, despite the fact that we welcomed the new approach in the country reports as of 2015 with 5 criteria, assessing the level of progress, assessing also the level of preparedness, this remains vague. And in my view, too vague. Like, some progress has been made. What does it mean? I mean, we need specifics. We need specifics, and I'm thinking in the case of Serbia now, we need a follow-up, for instance, to the Savamala incident, which is much more than an incident. It is a major and continues to be a major rule of law issue, which has not been addressed properly. It has been absent from the Commission reports. It has been very much present in our follow-up resolutions in the European Parliament. And I hope that this time around, the Commission will have the courage to mention this. The reasoning was for a long time, we don't engage in the exercise of naming specific institutions, but look at the same country reports and you will find specifics like on the Judicial Academy, etc. So it depends on what you want to say, what you don't want to say, but if it is about major rule of law issues where I mean, the steps required by the Ombudsman have been completely disregarded as well. This is also about the independence of institutions like the Ombudsman and the Commissioner for access to public information. But there I am diverging from what I wanted to say on the new methodology. Also, there is some recycled terminology. It's again about credible. It's about again about the European perspective. Those who know me well will know that I've grown allergic to this word perspective. We have been using it for at least 20 years since the Zagreb summit in November 2000. We have been using it. We have been affirming it, reaffirming it, confirming it. And in my view, the most honest thing about the Zagreb Summit declaration is where it says that it once again reaffirms the perspective. Now, read that twice. What does it mean? If you reaffirm, you affirm again. If you once again reaffirm, I mean, it becomes a bit, I'm not saying dishonest, but I mean, like repeating the same language, which is also indicative, of course, of the reservations that a number of EU member states continue to have about enlargement. And maybe more so, we will see what the German presidency will be able to deliver or not by the end of the year in its consultations with the EU member states. There are reservations, more so about Albania than about North Macedonia for the moment. So I would hope with anyone else that we can have, that we will not have a repetition of repeated postponements of major decisions like on Albania and North Macedonia, but I'm not sure that we will have, that we will see the first intergovernmental conference to actually open negotiating chapters in both countries. I'm not sure about that. So we could
Nismo sigurno da će posjeti ta konferencija gdje ćemo pričati o ovim stvarima, ali možda ćemo morati da radimo o tome da se te dve zemlje odvoje u ovom procesu, jer postoji određeni broj pozitivnih preporuka od strane komisije, ali svi znamo da u slučaju Albanije postoji duga lista stvari, odnosno prioriteta uvjeta koje bi trebalo da se ispune na efikasan način, ali vidjet ćemo šta će budućnost doneti. A sada, lično, ja sam malo bio razočaran i kao Evropski parlament, jer komesar Verhey je na različitim sastancima, na raznim prilikama rekao koliko je bitna uloga Evropskog parlamenta kada govorimo o novoj metodologiji, odnosno sprovođenju nadzora. Tako da bi moje pitanje bilo kako to da Evropski parlament ne pominje u dokumentu, kako to da da se razni savjeti za stabilizaciju i sve drugo pominju, ali parlament, ovo je ipak zajednički parlamentarni sastanak i da se uopšte ne pomenje, tako da jako se slabo pominje i civilno društvo i kao
in the European Parliament, we attach a great deal of importance to engaging with civil society, and I also personally do that in my work, and I find it very beneficial, and I enjoyed very much the previous session with all the interventions from civil society representatives.
Can I stop
about
here? Yeah, can I stop here, because this was you brought us some very important notions here, and I think just for the sake of dynamics and a good discussion, I would just transfer the floor to His Excellency Flessenkemper. So you flagged out the issues of rule of law and human rights, which actually stands as the fundamentals of a meaningful democratization process. And in the core of the European integration project here is Western Balkans are rule of law and human rights. But I think it is important to stress that this striving towards the standards of in the human rights and rule of law, it's common not only to the EU but also to the other international organizations and other international partners. So Council of Europe has really a proven track record in contributing to the improvement of the performances of the rule of law and human rights across the region. So, Your Excellency, just perhaps now, if we have overcome these technical issues, can we have your inputs from the side of the Council of Europe? So how do you see, what could be the concrete answers to the COVID-19 in terms of continuation of building and continuation of the efforts in building the rule of law and human rights in not only in Serbia but throughout the Western Balkans region?
Yes, thank you very much. We had the back in again, so I'm going to take off my headphones not to hear the other line. Thank you very much for the question. You know, it's thank you very much, first of all, for putting this together. The question is very relevant with regard to the general standards of what does it mean to work together in Europe and what to be European standards. And as you rightly pointed out, the Council of Europe has been the standard setting organization, and the European Union and the Council of Europe have been agreeing back in 2005, actually, in a meeting, that the standards would be derived from the Council of Europe and at what the European Union calls Article 2 of the treaty, meaning human rights, democracy, and the rule of law. Now, as you know, the Council of Europe is much larger than the Council in the European Union. All 27 member states of the European Union are members of the Council of Europe, and also Serbia is a member of the Council of Europe, as well as the other Western Balkan countries, apart from Kosovo, which, as you know, has a particular status both in the European Union but also with us. Now, when it comes to where do we see the countries of the region and also Serbia after and in the COVID crisis? With regard to a number of issues. Number one, I think the crisis had met all the countries in the region and in Europe a bit unprepared, but it also has exposed exactly a number of shortcomings with regard to the functioning of the democratic institutions, including, of course, way how parliaments act in a crisis, how the administration acts in a crisis, how government acts in a crisis, but also if you look at things like how local democracy functioned in the crisis or local government could function in the crisis. And I would align myself very much to what my friend André de Munter has said. This is not something which is particular to the Western Balkans, but it's something which we observe in all our member states. In all our member states, we observe that basically nobody is perfect, but we should also not forget that we are not equal in our imperfection, meaning the imperfection that you may be in a member state, for instance, like Germany, where I come from, with regard to the implementation of constitutional court judgments, with regard to whatever the composition of the supervisory body of public broadcasters, maybe at a different level in the overall picture than, for instance, the non-implementation of a number of commitments which have been taken in the Western Balkan countries. And let me be specific. We have seen that democratic institutions have been under stress during the COVID crisis. We have seen that parliaments have not been convening themselves. They have not been convening themselves even after elections for quite some time. And they don't expose exactly the kind of institutional self-identity which you would expect from mature institutions. I think you would see very rarely in other countries that a parliament was elected on the 21st of June and only had a session until now and not formed its own constituent bodies for more than 3 months. We are exactly 3 months after the election. So actually not being able to display exactly what it's supposed to do, represent the voter, represent the will of the people, and also hold to account and scrutinize government action, regardless of the fact if there's a new kind of coalition formed or not, because that is actually parliamentary self-interest. But also we have seen, for instance, during the crisis, that rule of law institutions have too easily adopted new techniques, which in as such are not bad. For instance, Skype trials, that we would have argued for the use of electronically supported justice, of course, in the field of normal civil law, but to go from 0 to criminal law offenses or misdemeanor offenses, including the provision of liberty, is quite a step. So I think what we have seen is here also some sort of too fast reaction of certain judicial institutions to comply what they may perceive was the interest of the executive. And if you then look at the general functioning of institutions with regard to the health sector, for instance, our Congress of Local and Regional Authorities in Europe has already, with regard to Serbia in 2017, highlighted the fact that the over-centralization of the appointment of health board chairs and education board chairs for that matter could actually carry a risk of over-centralizing decision-making with regard to fundamental and basic healthcare provisions. And actually what we have seen was a number of issues in this field as well, that over-centralization does not lead to better results necessarily when it comes to primary healthcare provisions. So we see overall a pressure that COVID has exercised on institutions, but even beyond, of course, the limitations to the freedom of assembly, the limitations to freedom of movement, but also the limitations that have been put on certain particular groups in society, for instance, the elderly, which were deprived of having visitors, or there was no possibility to visit people and to have meetings, is of course of concern, because there are fundamental rights engaged, like I said, is freedom of assembly and freedom of movement, but also, for instance, the Anti-Torture Committee of the Council of Europe particularly looked at those people who until now are not able to decide on their own whereabouts, or are in institutions, maybe prisons, home for the elderly, but also others where their situation has been very critical. And let me finish with the last thought on the specifics. Now, the Council of Europe has the advantage that, for instance, the Western Balkan countries are members. So we're not discussing anymore what is the standard. The standard is known, it's the European Convention on human rights and maybe specific standards. And then if we look at those, we find very clear and in clear language. I quoted, for instance, the monitoring report from the Congress of Local and Regional Authorities with regard to decentralization. And it's actually clearly naming where the problems are. Let me take another element, for instance, the Group of European States Against Corruption, GRECO. This is a peer review process where states look at what other states are doing. And the GRECO chairperson, the GRECO president, Judge Murchala, has been very clear with regard to COVID and the risk of corruption. I think André mentioned a number of procurement issues, and this is exactly where the GRECO reports will be looking at. And we are now entering the 5th round of evaluation in the GRECO cycle, and that will be looking particular at the high level of government, the primary executive organs, including heads of states and government, and what kind of precautionary measures are in place. But let me remind you that most of the Western Balkan countries have huge deficits with implementing the recommendation of the 4th round of evaluation, which particularly concern the independence and autonomy of the judiciary, of the prosecutorial services, but also of parliaments, financing of parliaments, lobby registers, etc. You name it. And on the lobby registers, of course, I'm waving to the European Parliament, which has done a lot of work on trying to get this under control. Let me name another instrument, the instrument of Moneywall, which is basically the instrument of looking at money laundering and financing of terrorist activities in those states like Serbia, for instance, which are not member of the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, which undertakes usually this kind of peer review financial action task force. So the Council of Europe and the OECD, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, have set up a special review system in Moneywall which look at money laundering issues. And we can see already that the money laundering issues are not being taken care of in the kind of way they would need to be taken care of. And we have a number of indicators here with regard, for instance, to the functioning of the Financial Intelligence Unit, which you all know there was a leak earlier this year in Serbia with regard to their activities, which actually raises more questions on the functioning of such institutions. But I can also continue with the Framework Convention on the National Minorities, which is a very important instrument with fundamental rights. The 4th Framework Convention Advisory Committee report clearly pinpointed a number of issues with regard to the commitment to implementing, for instance, values of the Framework Convention like cultural identity, multiple identities, and also this stretches into broader fields of democratic governance. And maybe as a last element of being specific, we have also seen that the implementation of the Istanbul Convention, meaning the Convention to Preventing Violence Against Women and Domestic Violence, has lacked a lot in Serbia, but also in other countries. And again, there the specifics are mentioned. There is an inadequate legal framework. There is an inadequate kind of statistical data gathering. There is not enough being done to combat patriarchal stereotypes in media and at higher government level, etc., etc. And maybe because we just finished the Pride Week here in Serbia, a number of issues related to the European Commission on Racism and Against Racism and Intolerance has repeatedly pointed out that the situation of the LGBTIQ community should be improved, including the adoption of a same-sex partnership law and a law on gender identity, both of which have been put on the docket a long time ago at the start of the last parliament here in Serbia, but have not been realized by the current parliament. And I don't hear any discussion with regard to the formation of government that these kind of issues and also the other issues I've mentioned would be actually moving up on the legislative agenda. So looking at all this picture together with the European Union, we try to provide cooperation activities and we try to keep them maturing, these kind of files. But what I can see from my personal experience over years is that the energy to work on these very specific questions, regardless of EU membership ambitions or other reasons for doing this, has somehow slowed down. We would have expected when Serbia joined the Council of Europe in 2003 that we would not be discussing, for instance, issues like judicial reform 17 years on. For 17 years, we have discussed now with the Serbian authorities of strengthening the autonomy of the judiciary. Very little has been done in reality. A lot of seminars have been made, a lot of recommendations have been made, but we have not seen the necessary legislative, financial, and constitutional changes. But also when it comes to minority rights, anti-discrimination, and the fight against corruption, we would like to see further movement, more commitment to reaching these aims, because all of these things are making problems when you don't do them. And we see that over and over again. Let me finish with something again, where it shows that this commitment to the values is a shared commitment, is the issue of money laundering. You may have followed that BuzzFeed has received a huge file of documentation from the United States investigative authorities on money laundering, which once again involves a number of actors, commercial actors from Europe, from the European Union and the Europe region at large, where it's clear that on the front of money laundering and preventing the movement of illicit gains of organized crime, much more needs to be done everywhere, and we hope that Serbia and the Western Balkans can be a partner here.
Okay, so Excellency, Your Excellency, thank you very much. So thank you for this very in-depth but comprehensive overview of the challenges. So this is not an exhaustive list, I would say. We could add to this a lot more, but I think it's important to stress a very clear message that you have sent to us. So in not that mature democracies, in this kind of events, institutions are under the pressure. They are under heavy pressure. So will they be able or not to respond to the demands of democracy constituency? That's the matter of not only institutions, but also the other stakeholders that should be involved. So then we come to the notion of partnership, and we also come to the notion of responsibility. So responsibility from the side of the institutions, but also responsibilities of the partners who needs to be engaged in the process. So I would just like to go back to André, and André, ask you something. So we have now drawn some of the challenges. We talk how institutions are under the pressure. We talk about the necessity being responsible, about the necessity of partnership. So we had 4 elections this year in the region. So those are the opportunities for new beginnings. And in the overall framework, what we just said, so what is your anticipation? Will these new opportunities open the door or close the door to more of fundamentals, more of rule of law, more of human rights in the region?
Yes, thank you very much, Vladimir. Well, it's difficult to predict the future, of course, but I mean, it's an interesting picture which we have. Of course, it was unfortunate in a number of ways to have these elections coinciding or pushed, if I may say so, in some cases during the pandemic, with all kinds of activities in the margin that may also have triggered the intensification of the COVID crisis in the Western Balkans. I think we all agree that it was not a good idea to have this football match with thousands of supporters. Then all spreading all over the region afterwards, and most probably contributing to the upsurge. But to answer your questions on the elections, the picture is differentiated. To start with the latest in Montenegro, what I see in Brussels is some degree of nervousness. The country has to get used now to kind of cohabitation formula between President Đukanović. I mean, he's not off the scene, he's very much on the scene as president, because he still has some years to go in his presidential mandate. And the newly formed government, or a process which is being finalized. This is new for Montenegro after 30 years. This is also new for Brussels. So we very much hope that this will not affect maybe initially a bit, but not too much, the ongoing reform progress. But let me now maybe be very harsh. I would personally stop calling Montenegro and Serbia frontrunners in the region. It is not because former Commission President Juncker said, and he acknowledged that it was an extremely ambitious, I quote even from the document, an extremely ambitious goal to have membership by 2025. I think by now most people agree. And then we enter again into the discussion of whether we should have dates to encourage or not, but that by 2025 it will not be possible. Look just at the media and freedom of expression scores, not only in rankings, but in four successive Commission documents which note no progress. And the Commission is desperately also looking for formulas to encourage people, but it has to be objective and say when there is no progress, there is no progress. I mean, the front runners are not running, and if they are not running in the right direction, or maybe not always. And I don't want to open the debate of the third countries and the role of China, Turkey, Russia, etc. in the region. But it is a fact of life. There has been no progress. In the case of Serbia, it is a bit of a different nature, where there was a landslide victory. Tobias already referred to the stagnation in the Skupština, in the parliament. The problem there is, and of course, part of the opposition decided to boycott the election, but we have a non-inclusive environment, which is potentially dangerous, which also affects the dialogue process. In Kosovo, we have very much the same problem, but in a different way, lack of inclusiveness, role of parliament, although we have had a few discussions in the Kosovo parliament, which is good because parliaments should hold their governments accountable on that. But the dialogue process, this is a long chapter and I don't want to go into detail, but my fear is that it will not take long before we are back to where we were under the previous High Representative, with many more meetings, which in itself is good because the more people meet each other, the more they hopefully get used to each other, and this can open extra doors. But the same veil of mystery surrounding these talks we have continuously, as we had before under Federica Mogherini when she had meetings, both parties completely coming out with different stories, contradictory statements, etc. By the way, I'm happy that Tobias referred to the national minorities. I hope that some people in Serbia and Kosovo will tell Mr. Grenell that in the so-called, I call it so-called Washington Agreement, which of course is not an agreement because you need at least 2 signatures, that it is wrong to talk about ethnic minorities if both countries use the term national minorities. I found that disturbing also because he was extremely condescending afterwards to journalists in the press conference, as you may know. Now, in North Macedonia, we have a continuation of the Zaev government, which I think would be applauded by many people because after the troubles, and this is euphemistic of the recent years, some degree of stability there is needed. But I also think that major EU reforms should be set in motion now in North Macedonia, because I mean, it's all very well and they deserve the credit for the Prespa agreement, but you cannot I mean, thrive only on the applause and the recognition for the Prespa agreement for a number of years without moving on. Bosnia-Herzegovina is a different story with the upcoming local elections. We will see what that leads to. Regrettably, in Bosnia-Herzegovina, the atmosphere is quite quickly spoiled when elections are looming. I'm not talking about 2 or 3 months before the elections, but practically the whole year. I mean, I invite you to look at the activity report of the European Integration Committee of the Bosnian Parliament 2018, which was still discussed in the House of Peoples in July. It is 10 pages, 3 pages about the actual report, and the activity, I think, was not more than one session of 45 minutes, which says a lot about stagnation. And this brings me maybe to a conclusion, and please feel free to interrupt me. I think a problem we have is with the political elites, which have been around for a long time, in some cases 20, 30 years in different roles, and together with many other people, I doubt whether there is a political willingness to move on the EU integration path. And that's why we desperately need more young people who can take responsibility and steer the countries in let's say, in a more diversified EU integration path. And this should be done as a matter of urgency, because, as we know, the brain drain is massive, and risks to leave some of the countries after a number of years without a political class that can take over from the ones who now form the governments. Maybe I should stop here, but maybe if I can add, I mean, Tobias would also be interested in this. In July, I have always been a big fan of the Council of Europe, as he probably knows. And in July, I was wondering, and I made my own little survey between the lead MEPs in the European Parliament on Western Balkans, our standing rapporteurs and the chairs of delegations, on how their cooperation was with their counterparts, with the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe rapporteurs in those countries. And there is a lot of improvement possible there. And I think in the sphere of rule of law, this is necessary. And I will personally try and get things moving there a bit as well. And the same for the cooperation on civil society with the European Economic and Social Committee. Sorry, I've been very long again.
Thank you very much for this. So let me just take some of the key messages you actually brought here. So we are talking about the challenges, and now you gave us a kind of a cross-country analysis of the key issues which are there. And let us try to be positive. So far we have a lot of gray notes in what actually you and Tobias were telling about. But what we actually saw from the previous videos at the very beginning, so there we have the people who are actually community actors. So they are the agents of the social change, and they gave us a very concrete samples from life that a community development can actually be a driving force. The community engagement can be a pillar of any kind of a democratic reforms. So when addressing very concrete issues, the changes are possible. But for changes to happen, they told us, and you also underlined this, we need more responsibility from the side of the political elites, from the side of those who make decisions. So we need more responsibility for government, because they have all of the resources. And they lead the process, whether until we rediscover a better system than democracy, it's their responsibility to lead the process. But apart from responsibility, there is also acknowledgement in partnership. And partnership, so acknowledging the non-state actors as those who also have the valuable resources to work together on a democratic processes. And now my question would be, so I will just pass the floor again to Tobias. So according to your experience and being engaged in Council of Europe, do you feel that the practices of partnership across the region can give us confidence that we can actually answer to the challenge of COVID-19? So were the partnerships so far of that quality? Did they produce results? I'm talking not only within the country, I'm talking cross-country. So were those partnerships answering the challenges of democratization, for example, of the issues that you have brought? And how we can count on this partnership in this new COVID-19 reality?
Thanks. Now actually it worked out with the sound system. I think you brought in now different issues, and I like the focus on the word partnership. But let me maybe unpack a number of things, and again pour a bit more water into the wine. We in the Council of Europe, we look back at democracy as a complex system with different, elements which need to come back together. And we have seen that democracy in the Western Balkans is still not so well developed. And I think we need to look at a number of factors here. Number one, are we actually talking about the same kind of thing when we're using words? For instance, political parties. Are political parties constituted in Serbia and the Western Balkans, for this matter, in a way that they function as schools of democracy, that there's inter-party democracy, intra-party democracy, that there's pluralism even in political parties, etc. We talked about parliaments already, and I think we cannot hide our disappointment, both André and myself, on the quality of parliamentary deliberations and the quality of parliamentary life. We talk about also rule of law institutions. We hear all too often, I remember, for instance, the prime minister of a rather large Western Balkan states saying that unfortunately she cannot make the judiciary more efficient because she cannot order them, the judges. Now, this actually exposes that there's a lot of more work to be done on understanding what do we mean by autonomy, what do we mean by independent institutions. And here we come with the non-governmental sector, because also the non-governmental sector and civil society and associated life is maybe also in this kind of double bind of that we're talking about, we're using the same words, but do we really mean the same things? Non-governmental organizations, they have to have a base. And they have to have a base in the citizenry, or they have to have a base in a professional community. And they also have to be able to mobilize own resources. And what we have seen, unfortunately, is that exactly those bases are very, very underdeveloped, and they need to take deeper roots. That's why I like very much that you made the reference to local activism. And I think we need to help also through European Union funding these grassroots organizations to develop deeper roots in society, including by being able to mobilize resources from society, and not only volunteer time, but also financial resources to make civil society a bit more independent of the state. But at the same time, they need to engage more with the state. I remember a meeting about some particular issue, and then I asked the non-governmental organization who I met, said, so who will you speak in your parliament with? Who will you address in the parliament? Who is your spokesperson on this issue or contact person? And the organization said, oh, we don't work with parliament in that way. And even though you may not like the majorities in the parliament, I think it's extremely important to always identify who, as the elected representatives, is actually possibly your advocate, or at least is formally in charge of a certain issue. It may be in the environment, it may be in social affairs, it may be in education, maybe in anything. But I think this kind of partnership is a two-way street. The civil society also needs to take institutions seriously and build up capacity in these institutions. So, I know this is difficult because as we talked about before, the institutions are not really maybe constituted in the same way. So I think we need to be a bit more thorough now, and as we are entering the third decade of the 21st century, that we are clear about the terms of what we mean, what it should entail, etc. Now, luckily, the Council of Europe has some ideas. We could mention the Venice Commission. If you look at the opinions of the Venice Commissions, you find some definitions, etc. And in the end, these are definitions. The standards are definitions. They're not up for opinions. Certain qualities of a democratic process is not a matter of opinion. But what we have seen globally, and I think it was mentioned by others, we are seeing a global trend that words lose meaning. You know, what is the real democracy? That democracy is not the ruling of the majority. It's basically something like the protection of the minority. we see a running down of the term of judicial independence. And this is a global trend. If you look at, for instance, what the European Court of Justice is going through these days with regard to the Attorney General, you exactly see the problem that member states of the European Union also find it quite unacceptable that you have an Attorney General who is maybe no longer from a member state, but still could have a valid mandate. And they just ended the mandate of the Attorney General. A number of these issues have to be done, defined, and taken extremely seriously. So this will be not an easy work now. And we should also not forget that, of course, the way how we have conceptualized democracy in Europe and in the whole of Europe now is very recent. We're talking about 80 years in most of Europe in this way of having universal suffrage, having full participation of minorities, etc., etc. If you're generous, you find some countries where you can extend it maybe to 100 years, but I would even be doubtful that it could be 120 years of having democratic states as we conceptualize them, as full participation of pluralistic societies. So here is a lot to be done in partnership. And maybe as a last thought, because also I have been too long now, is what I mentioned earlier, specifics. What we lack in the region, and it's increasingly so, is actually data. We are entering a census year, and for any of you who have studied the history of the Western Balkans and the particular dynamics around censuses, we lack not only structures and trust into what the censuses will bring in 2021, but we're also lacking general trust in data. We have seen, I've done a cross-analysis of Council of Europe monitoring reports, and it's almost everywhere it says, we don't have enough data on this, we don't have, the country is not doing this, they don't provide research on that, etc., etc. So I think we need to change also the culture that data about the country is something which is not owned by the government, it's owned by the society. And it has to be produced by the society, it has to be made debatable. But all too often we hit a wall. We don't know exactly what is going on. And that, of course, renders also to a certain degree Council of Europe instruments futile, but also it renders a certain degree of EU assistance futile because we don't actually know what is going on. And for instance, this will be now a big issue with regard to the follow-on on COVID. We heard, for instance, countries saying that they had problems running a database on COVID. There was an investigative journalism project in one of the bigger countries in the region on this. How many people actually died, how many, and the government said, oh, we don't have the capacity to run a database. Frankly, that is very, very worrying because, I mean, a database on cases, a case management database is nothing very particularly difficult and should have been able to be done. So we are running either into a question of willingness or ability, or actually to provide the full data set to everyone in society so that we actually discuss what is going on. And in the consequence of COVID, and of course in the reconstruction on, for instance, primary healthcare systems, we will need to know much more, and here comes the census again, more about the population setup in the territory. Now, from my personal anecdotal evidence of driving around in the region, I can tell you that the population pattern visibly must have changed dramatically in the last 10 years. So where do we put resources if we have data? Big important thing. Sorry, bit long.
I would like to stop you here because you have brought some very excellent notes, which are actually something that I think should be very important messages that should come out from this session. One is about the very nature of the partnership and the double role of the civil society sector here. From being a bridge between the governance and the citizens, being responsible to citizens, but being also a reliable partner to governance. On the other hand, the governance and the importance of being responsible and inclusive and transparent in its work. So these are really concepts. They really look nicely when you put them in a wording, but how to achieve them in practice. So what you don't see is actually I'm receiving a pouring comments within the private chat, and I'll just try to put them in a single comment as a kind of a closing remarks, and let me start with André, with you. So the comments are here, like EU was a kind of a framework for overall reform, and actually it should be as a kind of a supporter to a partnership which should be done by the countries, by the communities themselves. So it's about us making a community partnership. It's not about EU pushing for it. But in a weaker democracies, we need a kind of a framework. We need something to guide us. And I think this region from the Zagreb summit in 2000 chose European Union as this a framework. And actually, I think it urged at some point more decisive push for making partnership, making progress, making reforms. And this push has been lacking. And now we hear a narrative, you know, the partnership's all about the community. It's up to you. It's up to us whether we are going to achieve the reforms or not. But, you know, it's a kind of a double, you know, it's a double relations. So in a weak democracies, we need a kind of an environment and somebody pushing us to do so. Of course, the job is ours, but we need a kind of a framework. And I think there is a kind of a notion that this framework was lacking. And you now have this fatigue. For example, in Serbia, I've looked some researchers across the region. You have, for the first time, a kind of a tendency of citizens not quite understanding what this European integration really stands for after 2 decades of integration. So this is really not good signs. So just trying to summarize what I got here as a message. So would you have any kind of a closing recommendation how to push for the partnership? You know, how to build, you know, resilient stakeholder-based communities, and at the same time how to use the European Union as a framework to achieve this?
Okay, thank you. It's well, very difficult to say that in a couple of words. Maybe if I can add something which I wanted to say in my initial remarks about like pushing for reforms, etc. What we, I think, need on the EU side is to develop the ability to speak more with one voice and to be consistent in that. And I think what we should really do is to strive towards, but this is in the hands of the politicians, to streamline reactions to events much more between European political parties. As you know, a number of political parties in the region are affiliated. The terminology is different. They are full members, full observer members, closely affiliated, or whatever. But let me give one example, for instance. When in Albania, in Tirana, the National Theatre was demolished under cover of COVID, I would say. There was a fierce and very clear reaction from within the European People's Party. So on the Christian Democrat side, this was lacking in the Social Democrat camp, to put it that way, where, as you know, Edi Rama's party is affiliated with the Social Democrats. In Serbia, we saw the opposite, where the Social Democrats were extremely vocal about, you've seen the statements, etc., about the outcome of the elections, while the European People's Party was, to put it mildly, much more moderate, taking into account that the SNS is affiliated to the European People's Party. I think personally that this should be dealt with so that we can also have a more unified response to what we think is not going in the right direction. And so we can also, in order not to allow the political elites to play us out against each other, if you know what I mean. I agree that there have been mistakes in communication on the EU side, a visibility problem. I think there are lessons to be learned, and we have learned some lessons from the COVID crisis. You mentioned it yourself, Vladimir, in your introduction, that at least initially we were not really setting an example on how to react and to engage with the Western Balkans. This has been remedied. Let's see what the recovery and investment plan, which is associated with the new methodology, what it will bring, because this is one of the unknown factors. I hope there will be more complementarity with the Berlin process. My fear is a bit that in a push to do so much on infrastructure, connectivity, etc., we will have even more a plethora of initiatives. And I mean, it's almost like people are queuing up to construct this part of the highway. We have the Chinese, we have the Russians there, we have international financial institutions, we have the Berlin process, we have the Sofia priority agenda. We will have now the recovery program, as I understand, which will also have a focus on connecting the capital cities. Here we will also need more oversight and parliamentary oversight. Maybe I should stop here because we are running late.
So thank you for this. As His Excellency mentioned, we actually just now started to unpack a lot of issues which are going to be dealt within the upcoming days of the conference. I would just like to ask His Excellency for also a kind of a closing line. So just in a couple of sentences, having in mind your experience, the experience of your organization being engaged here in the region, what should be the landmarks for building partnership across the region, having in mind the COVID reality, but also this urge for building more resilient and democracy-oriented societies?
Thank you. Thank you, first of all, for having me. This is a very complex question, which I'm happy to discuss in more detail at another occasion. But I think one of the important things when we look at democracy in Europe and also tackling the post-COVID challenges, and actually we are still in the COVID challenges, is think beyond the region. Think about the Europe of the 47, or think about other countries as well, and think about the real values that bring us together and where the risks for the values are and what are the current and new risks. It's not only the freedom of assembly, the physical spaces which are limited, but I didn't touch upon what is happening. The more we move to the cyberspace, sometimes we have technical problems, but there are even more problems for human rights in the cyberspace, which we're discussing, and create these kind of alliances and create these kind of broader ways of discussing things. Because one of the things we have observed in the so-called Western Balkans, this is a term which we don't use at the Council of Europe, it's a term of the European Union, is that we are putting it in a silo. But this is not a silo. People are not living in a silo. People are living in Europe, they're living globally, civil society is facing these things all over the world. And I think we need far more dialogue, and also for the Western Balkan countries to maybe see some more experiences beyond, but even more important for linking the experiences in a mutual way. And I think out of this learning, more can come out than a purely, as you said it yourself, a relationship discussion. We are very much in a relationship discussion of them and us, EU, Western Balkans, and us, or different kind of, nationalities, countries in the region, and a them and us kind of thing. We need to come into something which is broader. For us, it's Europe, it's a broad Europe. It's standards, it's the norms, the ideas which we have put into text and which we work through text, read the definitions, endorse the definitions, and don't let you take self for a ride in the times of information disorder, which exactly is flourishing in the times of COVID, and should make us very, very cautious to what is going on. And solidarity, I think, of civil society beyond the region is key for this.
Excellency, thank you very much. First of all, thank you for being so persistent in staying with us despite all of the technical problems you were encountering. So we appreciate this very much. Andreas, thank you very much for your inputs as well. So I think it's time to stop. As our honorable panelists stated, so we have unpacked a lot of issues. I think they are going to be, some of them actually are going to be dealt in a very thorough way, starting for tomorrow at noon, when we'll have Mr. Bilicek and Mr. Regis discussing about this partnership in crisis relationship within the EU, and also between the EU and the Western Balkans, and what are the lessons that we can learn in terms of our future cooperation, at least for the sake of the region, in the joint mission in joining the European projects. So for all of you being with us, thank you for being here. Also, thank you for staying here with us. And we apologize for some technical issues that we had. So for us as well, this is learning by doing experience. And I can promise that we will be better as we move on. Also, your evaluation means very much to us. You will have a very simple evaluation survey on your Zoom, so we would kindly ask you to fill it so that we can move on improving the conference in the upcoming years. So we stay in touch and see you tomorrow at noon in the next panel of the 6th annual Move.Link.Engage conference. Goodbye, and stay safe and take care.